Hey everyone, it's Dave. Thank you for watching. As always, welcome back to the channel. Today is my obligatory sellout video where I try to capitalize on the popularity of the recent Starship launch and talk a little bit about the potential ways where we can actually invest in SpaceX today, even though it is still a private company not traded on the public stock markets. So a few things to get out of the way before we dive into this. Should really go without saying, but I think I have to say it anyway. Number one, I am still a huge Rocket Lab fan. I still have a ton of shares and haven't sold any of them. Number two, I don't think you have to be anti-SpaceX to be a Rocket Lab fan. I think there should be and will be and is room in the space industry for multiple players, and we always want competition. And really, my position is I'm pro-space. I want everyone to succeed. I want Rocket Lab to succeed. I want SpaceX to succeed. I want Amazon's Kuiper constellation to succeed. I want all these different companies pushing each other, driving down prices, driving innovation, driving each other to do better and make the space industry more exciting for the future, while doing that, making a little money for myself along the way. So hopefully you're okay with that position. I know a few people out there are extremely anti-SpaceX, and I'm sorry, but I'm just not in that boat. So hopefully you're okay with that. And with that out of the way, I just wanted to talk about SpaceX stock and how we could potentially gain some exposure to that stock price. Because, I mean, just look at this chart I'm going to hold up right now. Over the last 5 or so years, absolutely massive returns for SpaceX's stock, going from under $30 billion market cap to $150 billion. That is a really solid return. Obviously, Starship is an extremely exciting vehicle, the largest rocket ever to fly. It's shooting for complete reusability. Starlink is very exciting. The first massive global internet constellation that's really, accessible to everyone, very low latency, very low orbits. So the transmission doesn't have to go all the way out to geostationary orbit. The satellites are much lower to the ground. So you can do all those applications that need a very low latency, which is separate from the speed. That's more like responsiveness when you talk about latency. I mean, just think about the state of the space industry today, what it would be like if SpaceX and Falcon 9 had never come along. We would basically have no launch right now. The entire Western world would have ground to a halt in terms of launch. Ariane 6, not ready, not even really very close to being ready. Vulcan, not ready. ULA's former rockets, fully expendable. They're not making any more of them. So in terms of heavy lift and even medium lift, it would be very dire for the United States and the entire Western world if SpaceX weren't even around. That doesn't even go into Crew Dragon. Starliner has not even flown yet. So we wouldn't have been able to send any people to the International Space Station since the space shuttle when I was a kid if SpaceX was not around, because these delays have just been insane. So definitely, not taking an anti-SpaceX stance here. And there's a lot of things that I think we should like about the company. So, if you want to buy SpaceX stock on the private markets and just directly buy the shares, well, it's not easy, but it is possible. You need to meet some requirements, first of all, which basically are that you need to be an accredited investor in order to invest in these private companies. Those are some pretty stringent requirements. Number one, you're going to need a net worth of more than $1 million US, excluding your residence. So no, you can't add the value of your house to try and reach that 1 million mark. That mark is out of reach for me. So yeah, even me, I can't even pass this first hurdle. Definitely difficult for a lot of us investors out there. Or if you do not have that $1 million net worth, you can have an income of $200,000 or more per year, or if it's with a spouse, $300,000 or more, meaning if it's 150 and 150, that's okay, or 200 individually is also okay. Another mark I do not reach, yeah, I guess I'm disclosing a bit of my personal income here, but my day job does not reach $200,000, unfortunately. So the third is having a valid securities license, something I also don't have. So very tough requirements, but if you do meet those requirements, first of all, congratulations. You've obviously done quite well in your investing career, or you've done quite well on your regular career and you're making over $200,000. You can head on over to a site that will allow you to trade private companies. There's one called EquityZen I'm familiar with, but I'm sure there's a bunch of others out there. However, even once you sign up, it's going to be a bit challenging. You've got to find someone with their own shares willing to sell. Not the easiest thing, but at least you can get a seat at the table if you meet those requirements. So, assuming you're a regular person like me, you're not making over 200 grand, you don't have over $1 million readily available, what are our options? Well, number one might actually surprise you, and that is investing in Google. Yes, Google. I know you might be a little bit confused, but Larry Page, good friends with Elon Musk, Larry Page, one of the co-founders of Google, and Google did make a significant investment in SpaceX relatively early on, and they still own that today as far as we can tell. So all the way back in 2015, Google invested $900 million in SpaceX, which at the time was good for 10% of the total value of the entire company. Nowadays, Google still owns about 7.5% of SpaceX, which is a pretty solid chunk of the company, all things considered, especially for $900 million, considering today the value of those shares way higher than $900 million. I mean, 7.5% of a $150 billion company, we're talking $11.25 billion. So certainly a great return for Google's shareholders, and I do count myself among them, just a small slice that I've held for a long period of time. But I want to think about this critically before we dive in and, recommend everyone start buying up Google shares so they can get a piece of SpaceX. Let's think about this here. Google owns $11.5 billion of SpaceX. Yes, that's a lot of money. Google's market cap today is around $1.72 trillion. That is massive. So 11.25 of SpaceX versus 1.72 trillion of basically the whole pie. If you do some quick math here, that means buying Google shares gives you just a 1.12% exposure to SpaceX. Not ideal, right? The rest of that 99% is just the rest of Google, which you may or may not want to hold. And even if that 1% little slice does extremely well, it's hard to move the needle very much. A lot of it will just depend on what that remaining 99% does. So that makes it very difficult and hard for me to suggest anyone buy Google simply for the exposure to SpaceX. Now, I'm not saying buying Google is for sure a bad idea, but I think if you're going to do it, you have to be bullish on the entire company of Google and not only buying it for SpaceX. Me personally, I'm a little bit lukewarm on Google these days. I mean, it's okay. I'm not crazy about their Waymo investment. Some of their other investment, to me, I don't know. They just haven't really been as exciting over the past, say, 5 years as they were, 15 years ago when I found everything really exciting for them. So I'm a little lukewarm on Google. That 99% of the business, I don't really want to own that just to get the 1% slice. If you personally love Google, then I think this is a great option for you. So, have at it. But for me, I don't think so. That brings us to our next option for owning SpaceX, which is actually a mutual fund. So you might have seen this guy named Ron Barron, a very famous rich investor, runs a fund, several funds actually, and he's always going on CNBC talking about how much he loves SpaceX and how much he he loves Tesla and how he's got these super high predictions for where those stock prices are going to go. He's very bullish on both those companies. He's held both of them for a long time. Now, he runs a mutual fund. The retail one is called Barron Retail Partners, or BPTRX. Now, I'm sure you're probably all familiar with mutual funds, but the way they work is they hold a variety of companies inside them, try to give you some diversification, and you pay a management fee to the fund manager who decides, what companies the fund holds. So, throwing up a quick chart now of the top 10 holdings on this Barron Partners fund, and we can see Tesla at number 1, SpaceX is number 2 with a much more impressive 9.7% exposure versus that Google, which was really just a little over 1% of the whole pie. So at least here we're talking close to 10%. Now we're kind of getting somewhere, right? Like that will move the needle a bit more than a little measly 1%. But on the other hand, this does still leave over 90% of the fund being other things. So if you're not a fan of the other companies this fund is holding, then, it becomes difficult once again, because even if that 9.7% performs amazing and has a 5x, if the rest of the companies do extremely poorly and they're weighted more heavily, well, you're not going to have a good time. So what else does it hold? Well, we saw a very significant position is Tesla at 36-ish%. Personally, I am a fan of Tesla stock, so this doesn't really deter me. But on the other hand, seeing as how I already own Tesla stock and I don't want... Really, right now, I'm not trying to add to my Tesla position. So if I buy this, I'm kind of forced to add 3 Tesla shares for every 1 SpaceX share is how basically it will play out. Plus all these other companies. We have some in the real estate, consumer discretionary, healthcare, financials, that kind of thing. So really, I would take a look at the top 10-ish of these companies, see if you like them or not, and if you want exposure to them or not. So, and especially if you are bullish on Tesla and SpaceX, you might want to consider it because those top 2 holdings are, making up over 40% of the fund. If you're extremely bullish on them, might be worth considering. Now, the downside to this, though, is that you do have to pay those management fees. Personally, I'm not a fan of paying these management fees when I tend to hold... Well, I shouldn't even say that. I don't hold any mutual funds. I do hold some ETFs which are a bit similar, although they have much lower management fees usually. This 1.44 is a little bit towards the high end. So basically every year, 1.44% of the value of your entire investment you're paying to that manager, and they're going to, add companies to the fund, take companies out of the fund, rebalance their portfolio, and do whatever it is they do that they say justifies that 1.5%. Ideally, for me, if I want to invest in a company, if I want to invest in SpaceX, I just want it all to go to that company, and I don't want to have to pay this percentage. It may not seem that high, but year after year, most portfolios probably perform at, like, say, a 6% annual return. And if you're giving up 1.44% of that, that's significant. Now we're getting towards, over 15% probably of your returns for the year you're paying back in fees. Obviously, I personally try to do a lot better than 6%, and I'm sure a lot of you do as well. But, I just don't like paying the fees. I would say overall, I do think this is a slightly better option to get exposure to SpaceX than Google, just because that 9.7% slice is at least, significant, where that 1 point whatever, it's just so hard for that to move the needle in any meaningful way. Now, option 3 is kind of an option for the future. It's not an option for today, unfortunately, and I know this is very tough, but a lot of you are probably already aware, especially if you're fans of the space industry and SpaceX. SpaceX is planning to IPO their Starlink division of their business at some point in the future. So how this would work is SpaceX would basically spin it off, list it on the public market, sell a significant portion of those shares to public investors, retain, I assume, majority ownership, probably like 50 something percent of the overall company, but we would have access to the rest of that if we want to buy those shares. Now, there's a few reasons why this would be an attractive strategy and an attractive investment, as well as a couple reasons that make it a little bit less attractive to me. Let's talk about, some of the good things about potentially investing in Starlink. First of all, the revenue for this line of business, this internet constellation, is planned to absolutely smash the revenue of SpaceX's traditional launch business. We all know, I think, the total addressable market for launch is really not that huge in the grand scheme of things. But the total addressable market for internet across the globe is much larger. Putting up a chart on the screen here, this was actually leaked from its internal SpaceX document back in 2016, I believe. So this was a little bit delayed. Things obviously didn't play out exactly like this. They were a little bit delayed rolling out Starlink, getting their satellites launched, etc., but they are growing quite rapidly. And you can see in the chart here, the projection is massive satellite internet revenue growth, and launch revenue kind of peters off after, 2022, 2023. Still grows a bit, but from what I've heard, the total addressable market for the entire launch industry these days, only about $10 billion. So even if SpaceX tries to capture over 50% of that, not a ton of room to grow. But Starlink does have a ton of room to grow, as you can see by these projections. Now, yes, they did miss these projections, but as far as I'm concerned, they're still kind of on that trajectory. It's just kind of delayed, as if you think what they have in 2019 in this chart really happened in, say, 2021. So it's all pushed back maybe 2 years. But the trajectory still does look pretty good. On the right, they also have the projection for the operating income, and that is actually very solid as well. So they are projecting extremely good margins for this business. It could have great cash flow, be very profitable down the line. That's one reason why you might want to hold on to your hard-earned cash and put it into Starlink when it does IPO. Obviously, one frustrating thing about this is Starlink is not publicly traded right now, so maybe you want to invest in SpaceX and Starlink today, and you can't do that. Having to wait is pretty frustrating, especially because, once they do scale up, the opportunity for outsized returns might not be as great. However, we might not actually be as far away from a Starlink IPO as some people tend to think. So Elon Musk said in some of his tweets over the past couple of years that he thinks it makes the most sense to IPO Starlink once it's grown and has significant revenues, and once it's a profitable business, because that's when investors really will value the company to what he thinks it's worth. They will value it based on those cash flows. And he thinks, once it has those cash flows, it'll prove out the business and it would be a good IPO. So how far away are we really from that? Well, they're starting to get close. In 2022 alone, Starlink made $1.4 billion. Yes, it's not the $10+ billion we might have been expecting on the charts, but it's pretty solid, and it's growing rapidly. We're expecting the 2023 numbers to dwarf those 2022 numbers and continue on from there. That is up from just $222 million the prior year. So we're talking like a 5x in revenue in a single year. If they continue 5xing revenue for just maybe a year or two more, like now we're really talking some serious cash flows coming in. Also recently tweeted by Elon Musk is that Starlink has achieved break-even cash flow as of just this November. So they are no longer burning money on Starlink. It is now starting to switch over to become a profitable business for the company. as opposed to a cash burner, that other prerequisite Elon said that would have to be crossed before they go public. So I don't think we're quite there yet for Starlink to IPO, but it's starting to get closer. If you had to ask me, I'd say maybe 2025, a couple more years of that massive growth. It'll be a bit of a cash cow of a business, and if you want, you can just invest directly into Starlink when it IPOs. So exciting for a lot of reasons. Number one, the cash flow. The fact that Starlink is, the vast majority of the revenue projections of SpaceX and launch is just going to be a small slice. So, there's a lot to like there. On the other hand, I love my rockets. I'm a rocket guy. Starship looks super cool. It's unfortunate not to get any ownership of SpaceX and that side of the business. But on the other hand, again, on the other hand, if SpaceX wants to send starships to Mars and really start building out a colony, that's not a profitable enterprise. So we're in investing to make money. Do you really want to invest in a company that has stated a goal that at least in the next decade, I don't see any way for it to be profitable? Maybe not. So that's the give and take between those two options. The other thing is that if Starlink is a completely separate entity from SpaceX, they'll be extremely reliant on launch to continue to replenish their constellation, meaning they'll be extremely reliant on SpaceX. And if for whatever reason SpaceX, continues to divest their shares in Starlink, they're no longer a majority holder. They may not want to continue launching these satellites basically at cost, which they have done. They may start charging Starlink, the full price of launch, the same price they charge everyone else, making margins a little bit tighter. And it's a very critical piece of the business, not to own. Everyone talks about the future being these full stack space companies that do everything fully vertically integrated. Well, that Starlink business would no longer really be fully vertically integrated. They don't own launch and some of these other factors. So that is something else to consider, but at the end of the day, it's really the money that does the talking, and if they are making good revenues, that's all Wall Street will care about, and that will ultimately move the stock more than anything else. And number 4, my Rocket Lab fans should like this. Bit of a bait and switch here, but have you considered Rocket Lab? There's no perfect option here for investing in SpaceX. That's what I've kind of landed on. It's very difficult to do. I don't really want to, invest in a fund only gaining 9.7% exposure, paying 1.44% in maintenance fees. Starlink not ready. Google, even less of that. Rocket Lab is a great company. They do a lot of similar stuff. Neutron planned to be reusable out of the gate. They already have the space system side of things where they're able to mass manufacture their own satellites. They have several important contracts building out satellites for important customers, including satellites that are going to be used for Apple's iPhone emergency communications network. So the emergency SOS function on Apple phones, if you're out of a service area, the satellite function that will allow you to, make an emergency call or make an emergency text. Those satellite buses are being built by Rocket Lab right now for a company called Globalstar. Rocket Lab's kind of the subcontractor on it. But just goes to show a very important contract, and they're building out the capability to build a constellation of their own like SpaceX has done just a few years behind. Now, this constellation of their own doesn't necessarily have to be a Starlink competitor. There's many other, markets in the space satellite business other than internet. So remains to be seen what they'll do, but they have said they do fully intend to build, launch, and own their own space assets, operate them from orbit, and generate those recurring revenue streams like Starlink does that are so attractive to space investors. So that's kind of my pitch for Rocket Lab. It's kind of how a lot of investors landed on them, I think, since people get interested in SpaceX, find out they're not available, and wow, Rocket Lab looks really cool, doing similar things. They seem to be valued quite cheaply. Peter Beck, awesome CEO, very, stable, I would say, is one of the perks of him versus SpaceX's CEO. but also an extremely brilliant engineer, chief engineer for that Neutron project and the entire company himself. So not just a paper pusher, he's really deep in the design of their products and services, and very impressive guy. So let me know what you think down in the comments below. Are you planning on investing in Starlink once it goes public? Would you consider investing in that Barron fund for that 9.7% exposure to SpaceX? Or would you rather just buy some more Rocket Lab like me? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Thank you guys for watching as always. If you did enjoy this video, I hope you'll consider giving me a like and a subscribe. Really helps out the channel, and I hope you have a great day. I will see you in the next video. Bye for now.